Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be reviewing and comparing the two different texts of the 22nd book in the iconic Hardy Boys original canon, as of course the Flickering Torch Mystery. The original text was released in 1943 and was written by series creator Leslie McFarlane, who returns to the series for the first time since book 16, A Figure in Hiding, and this of course means the end of the John Button era of the books, where we saw a variety of crazy off-the-wall plots and plot elements, and that whole era from books 17 to 21 are typically viewed collectively as the lowest point of the original canon, though there are some fun highlights from how off the wall and crazy they can get in terms of the intensive set pieces in certain books. But coming back to the original writer's pen means that suddenly everything is grounded again, even if the plot outline that he was given by the Stratemeyer Syndicate had some similarities to the outlines that John Button had gotten. The revised text is from 1971 and was by Vincent Burinelli, who wrote a number of the revised text and other Hardy Boys books around this time. For those who are unaware of the revision process that was carried out, or don't really know what I'm talking about, the Stratemeyer Syndicate, who was behind not only the Hardy Boys, but also Nancy Drew and most of the other classic, iconic children's book series, decided in 1959 to try and go back and update and modernize the books that had been written before and up to that point. The idea was that they wanted to remove some dated aspects and, most of all, some of the bits of racial stereotyping that crept in, along with certain other things, as these books did stretch back, in the case of the Hardy Boys, to 1927. The idea was that they wanted the original books to be more in line with the books that were coming out as new works in 1959 and onward. So what they did, without telling anyone, is hire a variety of ghostwriters and went back and rewrote all of the books up to that point. So the first 38 books of the Hardy Boys canon were all rewritten, reworked, and republished under the same title, and these were done out of order over a large span of time by completely different ghostwriters. So it was a varied process that resulted in books that either somewhat resembled or mostly resembled the original book of the same name, and then others where the resemblance was almost non-existent, and in the most extreme cases, you essentially have two completely different books with the same title and the same Franklin W. Dixon invented author credit, as all the books were ghostwritten. The same went for Nancy Drew and other series that were still going, so you have to actually look at the two different texts of the first 38 Hardy Boys books and the Nancy Drew books that were rewritten in order to actually figure out what was retained, what was changed, and also it makes for a fascinating comparison, because in the world of literature and printed fiction, I don't know if there's anything quite on this level of completely reworking a series. But the other thing that usually isn't gone into is that this was done as a means to also streamline the books and make them shorter, which meant that they could be published more cheaply. So it was also a cost thing, as the books would eventually transition into being what is known as the picture cover and not have a deluxe hardcover with dust jacket. So it was a means of getting the books cut down and simplifying them. And that's why a lot of fans have used the term or criticism of literary vandalism, in that a great deal of the original texture and humor and world building of the original stories, especially of the ones written by Leslie McFarlane, was lost in this process. And there is a good argument for that, but you do have to go on a book-by-book basis, and it's a fascinating comparison to do so. To talk about the plot of the original text, Frank and Joe Hardy, teenage detectives, are brought into a case by world-renowned scientist Asa Grable, who is a bit eccentric, but also has a estate out in the country outside of Bayport where the boys live, where he actually takes care of various rare moths and is trying to develop a new type type of silk to be utilized in parachutes to support the war effort, because this is another of the wartime Hardy Boys stories. So there is at least some allusion to the war currently raging, and this having important themes, that the actual threat is that this could be something that could hurt the war effort, because this is a scientist who's trying to develop a super strong type of silk to be utilized in parachutes and other materials for the armed forces. So there is a governmental connection in terms of the war effort. Somehow his estate and greenhouses are being broken into, and things are being stolen, and he's losing some of these important moss. How it happens, nobody knows, as there is a relatively sophisticated burglar alarm, and somehow the individual is getting around it. So Grable is trying to get the services of the boy's father, world-renowned investigator Fenton Hardy, but since Fenton is, as usual, busy on another case, the boys decide they're going to try and convince Grable to let them handle it. And they're also going out to the state experimental farm to volunteer over the summer, which is out in the country, so they will be able to sort of spy on Grable's estate. This is also because Grable receives a threatening message and decides he doesn't really want the boys to investigate, because he's also fearful for them in addition to himself. So the boys agree they will just try to act like normal farm workers and keep an eye out and try to watch the place at night without being spotted, and feign innocence if they're caught. Fenton Hardy's case is actually for the federal government in a way, because he's investigating road and construction sites that are being sabotaged by a gang that's stealing all the construction supplies. And there we have the tie-in with the title as the only sort of clue to the gang's activities, which usually seem to take place at night, is that in the general area there is always glimpsed some sort of flickering torch in the distance, and there's no sign of the gang's activities until the next day all the materials are now stolen. The boys travel out to the country and stay with a friendly nearby farm owner, but of course they're not alone. Their Peppery has an opinion about everything Aunt Gertrude goes along for the ride, and this, along with the characterization of the boys' best friend and perpetual chum Chet Morton, show that we finally have the series' primary writer back, as they are now sounding much more like themselves. They have the requisite amount of humor and sarcasm, and also the boys themselves act much more as we expect them to. So there is a return of the sense of grounded world building and texture, even in the various small moments, which was sorely lacking in all of the John Button written books. And I think the way you know you're reading a Leslie McFarlane written Hardy Boys book is that there will be moments that make you, even as an adult, laugh out loud, because the humor is so grounded and earned and character based, and the world is so fully realized, the world of the story, that the humor really lands, and it's all perfectly in the moment humor. That's, again, something that you really only get in the McFarlane Hardy Boys books. The boys are working at the state experimental farm by day and dealing with all sorts of various plants and experimental farming techniques, in addition to some of the other workers who give them a hard time. They try to examine the Grable estate at night and keep an eye on things, and in spite of their best efforts, the various thefts and break-ins still continue, with no one being able to pinpoint exactly what's going on. Additionally, they're in the general vicinity and area where some of the gang thefts are happening at the construction sites. So at night they try to spy on some of those, and do eventually come across the vision of the flickering torch in the distance. The different plots keep intertwining quite nicely, and the story proceeds at a natural pace, which is greatly aided by the sense of grounding that you get from the change in writers. This story having a rural setting for the most part, and having a sense of a slower pace and maybe some lower stakes to it. It does have some connections with some of the plots of the previous John Button books, so you can very much sense that this is coming right after those, but I can't stress enough how important it is to have the original writer back to get that sense of grounding and credibility to make the story flow. The middle act of the book builds up to the set piece that's depicted on the early covers, where the boys are trying to catch the gang at work with the flickering torch being glimpsed at night, and they've split up essentially, and so we have the boys in a boat on the water looking up at this hill where they see the flickering torch in the distance and a mysterious figure, and before they can ascertain what's going on, the flame goes out. It's a wonderful moment in terms of the visuals, but that's the sort of dramatic moment that's used as the highlight to then sell the book on the early covers. Eventually we build to the final act climax, which also involves the boys stumbling onto a former mine, which is being used by the gang, and have to get out of several near-death traps, with some moments almost reflecting back to the ending of some of the previous original text, such as Secret of the Caves and the Shore Road Mystery. Even though the story itself is relatively lower key than some of the other adventures, there are some moments of interesting danger elements that do add a certain level of suspense. All of a sudden, there's an earthquake that happens in the area, which is unexplained and sets everyone to try and figure out exactly what happened. Also, the boys have to rush back to Bayport at one point because their house is set on fire by nefarious individuals, and they themselves are captured and kidnapped for a portion of the book and have to try and rely on their ingenuity to get out of the situation, or at the very least deduce where they've been left for a time. Ultimately, by the end, we find that both cases are connected somehow, and both the Hardy Boys and their father Fenton Hardy are there to tie up all the loose ends, so everything is satisfactorily explained. The book is a satisfying read, and it is wonderful to get back to the original writer, Leslie McFarlane, being in charge of the plot. Unfortunately, it is still coming off of the sort of style that emerged in the John Button era in terms of the story outlines that were generated by the syndicate and then given to the writer to actually go flesh out and write the book. So this is another book kind of set more in the countryside, and in terms of the actual action of the plot, there is admittedly quite a bit of the Hardy Boys and their friends kind of wandering in the countryside and having to go back and forth and having to travel back and forth between there and Bayport a number of times back to their hometown. So there's a little bit of the book sort of meandering, but far less and much less felt in what we saw in the John Button books leading up to this point. So I think it's a satisfying read. It really has some of the old spark to it that was felt so deeply and made the first 16 books by McFarlane so magical and memorable. Maybe not as much because now we're at book 22. There were all these books in between. It's now 1943 and the war is going on. So, it's understandable that maybe it doesn't have the same sort of complete inventiveness or magic spark to it as the first 16 books do, but there is some of it here, and that's what makes this book a good, fun, enjoyable read that holds up all these years later. The plot may not be the most attention-grabbing plot of a Hardy Boys book, but it all holds together really, really well, and when you're reading the original text in chronological release order, you cannot get over the fact that this is us getting back to the original writer, and all the issues of books 17 through 21 are now out the window, and it's like we're getting back to what these books really are, even if this one isn't as flashy or as polished or as good as some of the previous books of the first 16. It's a solid, well-told adventure with some nice, unique elements and a unique sort of plot hook of trying to find missing, stolen silkworms. And so, it's got a mystery that has to be solved, and it's not resolved in the way that the reader expects. There is a nice bit of surprise towards the end, and there are some really nice close calls for the boys. I mean, at one point, the boys are almost killed by a mine collapse, but then in another, they're almost killed by poison gas, let alone their house was set on fire and they're knocked out and kidnapped. And, they do have to really get out of tough situations. And that's always something you feel much more in the original text, because the level of danger was never as extreme or as deeply felt in the revised text. I'd say my primary criticisms here are that I do think the sort of middle section does meander a bit, and the theft of the silkworms being connected to the gang stealing from the federal work sites. It's explained, but not really detailed exactly why members of the gang also might be interested in what Grable is doing. So I would have liked for that to perhaps been a little bit more detailed, but overall it's still an enjoyable read and such a relief to get back to McFarlane writing the books as opposed to John Button. But there's also some crazy wacky moments in this book that are entertaining just due to their craziness. For example, there's one moment where the boys have to take their car to a repair shop after one of the set pieces where their car was damaged, but their car is actually picked up by a gang member before they can get to it as a means to obviously thwart the boys further. But the gang member is in disguise and actually in drag, so it's a guy in a dress and makeup and everything who shows up at the garage to pick up and steal their car. I don't exactly know why he needed to affect a disguise like that. So right there is another sort of out there, slightly wacky moment or notion that feels right out of books 17 through 21. So obviously, we're done with the John Button era, but we're also not quite out of the woods yet in terms of there's still some of those slightly silly or out there elements that are here. So this is a transitional book in a way. The revised text was released in 1971 and written by regular writer Vincent Burinelli. This has a number of similarities to other revised text around this time. Like any of the revised texts, you then have to look at it compared with the original and see just how much of the original story or plot is retained. This one is typically described as being a completely different work, but in reading it back to back with the original, there are enough similarities and some of the plot structure in addition to the general idea of the case Fenton Hardy is working on. That means that there's enough of the original book here that makes it safely able to be called the Flickering Torch Mystery still, and we get not one but two explanations for what the flickering torch of the title actually could be. This time, it's Fenton Hardy being tasked by an insurance company to investigate a series of thefts of valuable air cargo in and around airports and also mysterious disappearances during cargo flights. Frank and Joe are asked by their father to investigate a part of this, and so instead of the case about Asa Grable and the silkworms, it's now the Hardy boys being asked to investigate mysterious crashes where two pilots mysteriously crash their planes, and it may be somehow tied to the case of the air thefts. So the boys, along with Chet Morton, travel up to Marlin Crag Airport outside of Beamerville and try to run the case to ground and aren't really getting much of anywhere, and quickly run into various individuals who seem to know more than they let on. Chet Morton's hobby this time around, because he always has a hobby in one of the revised texts that usually ties into the case somehow, is his desire to build his own airplane. So he's continually going to airplane junkyards and buying pieces of scrap and trying to build his own fantastical Morton flying machine, which of course is as ill-advised as most of his hobbies. But the subplot and what most people remember from this book is that this is the book where Frank and Joe are in a band with their friends, and this being the early 70s, it's rather amusing that it's often described as a sort of folk rock band, something more from the sort of late 60s era, and the musicality is very limited in its description, so you almost get the feeling that it's being written by somebody who's older to begin with. And there's also the potential influence of the short-lived Hardy Boys animated cartoon series that lasted for about a season in 1969, that I believe was done by Filmation, which led to the creation of the Hardy Boys actual band, who actually recorded and released 2 albums at least under the name. So that was now in the pop culture atmosphere, that the Hardy Boys themselves were tied to the idea of being 2 teenagers in a sort of rock band traveling around solving mysteries. So that's been worked in here, and it seems like it was probably done on purpose. But at the very least, that's not forced, and it's worked into the plot, and Frank and Joe are still acting the way that we expect them to. As in the original text, there's a lot of traveling back and forth between the location and their hometown of Bayport, so that is very much replicated. Chet Morton is still the source of comic relief, but also the amount of action has been greatly increased, as has the pace, due to the revised text always having a significantly shorter page count. Also, the influence of the spy craze is felt because the boys get their hands on various bits of technology, and the levels of the dangerous elements they get into or predicaments they find themselves in is also greatly increased. So instead of the original text getting into featuring some elements of rare minerals, potentially even radium at one point, here in the revised text, the boys eventually discover that they may have come into contact with something that had been irradiated, and that might very well be the surviving engine parts of the plane wrecks that they've been able to locate. So now we have the element introduced that the Hardy Boys are not just trying to find information for their father, they're not just trying to help him nail a gang of thieves, but there may be radioactive materials involved, and those are eventually revealed to be radioactive isotopes. So already the level of stakes have dramatically increased, and this continues to happen while we go back to the Hardy Boys and their activities in their band, but they're using it to also work their way into a mysterious nightclub that seems to have something to do with the case and has a variety of acts play there. So there is a bit of subterfuge. They are still acting as detectives and almost sort of doing some surveillance and spy work in doing so, and manage to infiltrate the Flickering Torch nightclub as members of a band. So it's a good way to work in what could have been something that was very forced, and so it never really sticks out, but it is kind of odd that our detectives are continually having to keep up their band practice activities and such. So the flickering torch of the title either refers to the nightclub of the same name, or it could be the rather ominous oil refinery that has a giant derrick that spits a flame at night that goes on and off and flickers, and that could have been what the pilots were discussing in their last radio communications. If you were thinking that this book is too different from the original text to still be called the Flickering Torch Mystery, it actually does still have a version of the scene from the original text where we have the boys split into pairs, and they're trying to observe members of the gang, so they think, carry out their thefts. And this is around a sort of seaside cliff, and so you have 2 of the boys down in a boat looking up at a mysterious, ominous figure who then mysteriously disappears. So the revised text still retains the sort of signature moment from the original text. That, and the fact that the book still has the Hardys dealing with a gang of thieves that are robbing various areas, and the task that the boys are on manages to tie in with the case Benton Hardy is working on. Plus, there's traveling to a faraway town to carry out investigative work. You can recognize enough of the original text, but it's really only going to be made apparent if you read the text back to back. If you read them separately, you probably wouldn't see those connections. So you can recognize the ghost or the structure of the original text in the revised text. This being a revised text, the faster pace and shorter page count really means that the story moves along at such a fast clip that you may not have all the individual moments resonate. But it should be commended for having a great deal of action and a number of sort of cliffhanger predicaments, and it really puts the boys in some dangerous situations where they have to think on their feet and survive a number of close calls. They also have moments where they're not only engaging in detective work, but also there's a moment where they actually wear a hidden concealed microphone and try to get someone to reveal information. There's a moment where they technically could be considered as trespassing in trying to discover more of the gang's activities. They're shot at and nearly killed multiple times, and even managed to utilize a Geiger counter to try and hunt down the missing plane wrecks. And the reason why they may be irradiated is that it's uncovered that this gang may be dealing in smuggling stolen uranium isotopes. So it's not just that this is a case of smugglers. It's not just that the boys are also in their own folk rock band. It's not just that there's something introduced into the plot that's radioactive. It's that it's stolen uranium isotopes, which could be used for a whole host of different things. That element isn't as refined, and so when you get to the third act and climax of the book, the faster pace kind of increases even more, and so there's a bit of a flurry of events towards the end of the book. There's a lot of great action sequences as well, and there are some moments where the boys could theoretically be killed, which does add to the suspense and heighten the drama. So that is something you do get in the revised text from time to time, but it's usually not as much as this one, where you get more of the threat of them actually having to fight for their lives. The climax is quite action-packed and features a number of interesting reversals, with Frank Hardy himself being captured by the gang and spirited off to potentially be disposed of. But there are some new characters introduced in the third act towards the end, and that, along with the increase in an already fast pace, does make it feel a little bit jumbled in a way. I think there's a reason why this book is chiefly remembered for the rock band aspect of the boys, playing guitars, and the interior of the Flickering Torch nightclub being described as having psychedelic lights and stuff, as if the 60s hadn't ended. So it is a solid reading experience. It's a tighter narrative that's much more developed and has a lot more going on than the original text. But once again, the trade-off is there's not as much world building, there's not as much characterization, there's not as much time spent on building the story naturally because of the shorter page count primarily, but also the directive on the revised text is always to try to have action beats continually to not have somebody's attention wander. I think each of the text is good for its era and very representative of the era of the books it was being released in, but it's also an unfair contest to compare anybody to Leslie McFarlane writing the Hardy Boys, because he was primarily the person who built the whole universe as he wrote the first 16 books. There are enough elements in the revised text that make it feel like a completely different book, so I understand why some consider it a completely different work. But when you read them back to back, there's enough of that structure still there that you can recognize. Technically, it's a hyper convoluted retelling of a very similar story with many additional plot threads added and entirely new and unique scenes throughout, in addition to a completely new group of villains and henchmen and things. So I think each book is good. I think it's rather difficult to say one is better than the other, since outside of the structural similarities, they are very different, and they were written at completely different times with totally different aesthetics. If I was forced to choose, the original text is the better written book and the more engaging book on the whole in terms of just as a work of literature. But the revised text is good in its own right, but it has different aims, and it has the unique factors of it being the one where the Hardy Boys are in a rock band, and they're also searching for stolen uranium isotopes. Now to talk about the cover artwork designs, as I like to do in these videos, the Flickering Torch Mystery had 3 different covers. The first, for the original publication in 1943, was by Paul Lawn. His cover is in the style of his other Hardy Boys covers and is very much what you expect from a early 1940s cover for the series. This has the title in white on the top, with the Franklin W. Dixon credit in yellow on the bottom, and then the Hardy Boys logo in red in a sort of cursive font. So that's in keeping with the other books at this period. We have the scene being depicted of the boys observing from a canoe on the water of the gang member looking ominous, waving what looks like the flickering torch, with Joe Hardy sort of looking behind him before they both disappear. There is a nice sense of this being ominous because it is obviously taking place at night or when it's darker, as it is in the book. There's a good sense of composition. We even have the sort of icy looking waters on the bottom. We have the boys in shadow because we're seeing them from behind. It makes the mysterious figure waving the torch the center of attention for the whole cover, and it's a very natural looking painting. The landscape is perfectly represented, and most importantly, it looks like the scene in the book that was described. So it's a very good painting. The only issue is that there's just sky over the top where they put the title, so it means the top third of the cover seems kind of more like dead space, and also the figures are a bit smaller in size because of that. So the composition is good. It just has, to me, always looked a little bit like it's kind of shifted down some and made smaller to accommodate the overall book dimensions. In 1962, we got an update by the artist John Leone, this in the style he was doing, where he was basically, I think, tasked with replicating the same event but in a more realistic style. So this has the boys in the canoe looking up on the cliff and seeing the figure with the flaming torch. This is even more ominous because we have the crashing waves and the jagged rocks on the bottom, and the figure is up much higher. The problem is, as with most of the Leone covers at this time, similar to the first cover, there's quite a bit of dead space in terms of the composition, and they have the title in the font of the era just sort of set on the top. But here, the figure is up so high that it's actually obscured by the title. As you can see, the Flickering Torch Mystery is literally covering the mysterious hooded figure with the torch barely visible over the Flickering Torch Mystery. And then over on the far right, just next to the giant floating letters in the sky, is what's supposed to be Joe Hardy, and you don't even really notice him or the ominous figure when you first get this because you're too busy looking at the title. You don't even realize there's figures up there. Most of all, you're looking at the boys on the bottom in the canoe, and they're about to smash up on the jagged rocks where the surf is rough. So that's the real focus of the image, and that means the rest of the cover is kind of like dead space, compounded by the text making even more dead space. So this is just a cover that to me has always seemed like it was a misfire. The artwork itself is good, the composition is pretty good, but the sizing is a bit off, just like the first cover, except everything is sort of ruined by the title and the logo just being sort of slapped on the top and obscuring everything. It just has never quite worked for me. It has drama to it, but it also has a bit of a blandness to it. And all the covers of this era, as they were transitioning into the picture covers away from the hardcovers with dust jackets, all the covers at this time kind of have degrees of these elements. But here, I think it's all on one, and unfortunately, the title and logo placement really messes things up. Another particular issue that I've seen on this cover, and happens sometimes on Hardy Boys covers, is that the skin tones can sometimes be really saturated. So here on the bottom, if you look at Frank in the canoe, he kind of has a very red cast to his skin tone, and that combined with his black hair has typically made some of the printings of this particular cover that were not done as carefully as others. There's a tendency for the colors to get oversaturated. So this is one of those covers where sometimes if there's a lot of extra color saturation, Frank looks more like he's being depicted as a Native American character, but in a very overdone way, where his skin is extraordinarily red and his hair is extraordinarily black, and it looks quite odd because the color can get so boosted sometimes. Then when we transition over into the revised text, we get the 1971 revised text cover by series artist Rudy Nappy, who by this point was doing a new style of the Hardy Boys, plus some oversized element meant to illustrate a part or the spirit of the story. And this would be done on a very striking colored background that looked almost painted in, and the overall cover would have, in some ways, a sort of psychedelic effect or a very surreal quality to it. Well, here you get the full psychedelic effect because we have the boys with their guitars, and then we have the flickering torch in terms of the oil derrick with the giant gas flame. And then we have what looks like psychedelic flames coming out of that, plus sparkles on what is really a deep blue, almost purple tinged background. This is easily the most psychedelic of the Hardy Boys covers in the original series, and very much fits the sequence where the boys are playing in the Flickering Torch nightclub, and it's said that all the lighting is psychedelic. So this fits the revised text. It's immediately attention grabbing. It doesn't really suggest the rest of the story, but this is one of those covers that is so uniquely of its era and of the artist's style at the time that you really can't help but love it. And this is the kind of cover we don't get anymore, a cover that is unapologetically out there and attention grabbing. Now, for editions in my own collection, I do have 3. This is my copy of the original text with the original cover art. The cover is in pretty good shape. There's a little bit of wear, which is why I've got it in one of the protective plastic covers. Of course, this is in the yellow spine era of the series, hence the yellow spine and the custom logo of this time. Inside, we have the orange end papers of the era, and the title listing goes to The Secret of Wildcat Swamp, which would put this printing at around 1952. Here is the printed front piece artwork and the title page, the original copyright date, and the contents listing. And of course, you can always identify original text by the different typeface and the fact that the books will almost always be 200 pages or more. And then, of course, here's page 1. The rear flap advertises for the Lone Ranger stories that Gross & Dunlap published, and then the rear is the Zane Grey Adventures series for boys. Then you slip off the dust jacket to reveal the iconic tweed boards of the hardcover itself. The tweed nickname comes from the sort of tweed pattern that's found on the actual book itself, and then the title and classic logo are, of course, embossed. Then, of course, we have the spine as well. My copy with the second cover art is from the picture cover era of the books. So this has the updated artwork, and it's in pretty good shape with just a little bit of wear. And as I was alluding to before, the color is so extreme on Frank's skin tones that he now resembles more of a lobster man. When you look closely at the top of the cover, you can more clearly make out the figures up there, but it also underlines how it was a silly idea to just slap the title over them. You have the iconic blue picture cover spine of the era, and then the equally iconic rear cover, which lists to the Mystery of the Aztec Warrior, which would date this printing around 1964. Inside, we have the multi-scene end papers in brown and white, as they were in this era before they were redone later, and then nicely retaining the original front piece artwork. So this is a printing of the original text, and it's one of the books you can actually get the original text of in picture cover more easily because it did last through the 1960s. It wasn't rewritten until 1971, as opposed to books that were revised much earlier. Basically, the earlier one of the books was revised, the more difficult it is nowadays to track down an original text copy simply because there are less of them, and the book was taken out of circulation for the revised text. My copy of the revised text is from the more modern flashlight era of the books. So this, of course, has the uniform cover design and takes the original cover and crops it somewhat to then fit in the uniform parameters. So it has the spine that matches and then has the uniform rear cover that all the flashlights have. In terms of the art reproduction, this one is done really well. There's nothing that's overcropped, and the color is really well reproduced, even if this might be a little bit softer in detail as compared to a mint condition original 1970s copy. Inside, we have the updated title page and the new front piece artwork, plus the revised contents, where, of course, you see very easily that the book is much shorter, and then the updated copyright page with all of the dates, the first being the date of the original text. This is also a printing from the year 2000, and it's much better when you find the flashlights that were made around this time, as they're usually better printed and more sturdy than the copies from, say, 2005 and later. The revised text, of course, contain the iconic illustrations throughout, which the original texts do not. So here the book wastes no time in setting up the boys as rock musicians as they just start jamming in their living room. Here's a nice scene where Joe tackles in a flying leap a would-be saboteur in the middle of the night. And a nice bit of subterfuge. Callie Shaw, Frank's girlfriend, gets to get in on the action and help the boys befuddle an unwitting potential gang member. Here Joe Hardy engages in one of the classic moments of Pulp Fiction cliches of trying to chase criminals but not having a car, so he tries to grab onto the back of a vehicle, but this isn't a car, this is an oversized X-ray company truck. Inside the Flickering Torch itself, the boys try to get away with a piece of the band's gear, which may or may not be tied in to the smuggling of the isotopes. So those are the two texts of Book 22, The Flickering Torch Mystery. As I've said, each one is a good representation of where the series was at that time in both 1943 and 1971. Basically, two different worlds of publishing and styles, and each one is a great book for that era of the series in terms of how the books were being written. But to call the revised text a completely different work is probably not entirely true. When you do read the books back to back and you do compare them, there are enough similarities and enough moments of the original plot and structure that you can recognize in the revised text, but the revised text just piles on the subplots, characters, villains, and especially the action. This is one of the more action-packed of the revised texts of this period. In fact, so much so that in some instances it might be a little bit far-fetched for teenagers to be getting into this level of constant death threats and skullduggery and all doing this while being able to keep up with their band practice. Each book builds to a satisfying conclusion, but I wouldn't say that either is up there in the top tier of their respective texts in terms of the original text and the revised text. But each one is great in its own right and a satisfying adventure and a satisfying book to come back to. But I think there's enough of the original text and the revised text to still say the revised text is a dramatically, unbelievably, drastically altered version of the original, but it is not entirely different. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series and the way the text grew and changed over the years has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you're like me, returning to the series as an adult and you're trying to find a way to make the books fresh again, trying this approach of comparing the text by reading them back to back is really the best method. And it's something I think all fans of the series should do at some point, because it's really illuminating and makes you think about each text in its own right and also how it compares to the original version. So in my next video, I will return with a review and analysis of both texts of Book 23 in the series, The Melted Coins. But until then, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely Hardy Boys editions for your collection. Keep reading the classic Hardy Boys series, keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.